All right, guys, on today's video, we're diving in talking about crossbow maintenance. So if you're looking to learn about how to maintain your crossbow, please check out this video, like and subscribe, and let's dive into it right now. All right, guys, when I pull my crossbow out of the case for the first time of the season, the very first thing I'm going to look at as far as crossbow maintenance goes is going to be my string condition and cable condition. So, you know, the strings can get wore down over time on a crossbow because there's a lot of friction. Let's just face it, you know, those bolts get slung out of this thing at a very high velocity, ton of friction right here on the rail. So keeping this rail lubed up is going to be one of the main concerns that we need to look at. And I have a couple tubes right here. So one is the string wax, and we're going to look at what we need to be applying string wax to and what we don't need to be applying the wax to. But also we have crossbow rail lube right here. You know, typically if I'm putting this away for the season, I'll go ahead and wipe all of the grease off of this thing. That way it's not sitting in the bow case, you know, possibly collecting dust and things like that. You know, this thing is dry as it can be right now. So before I go out and shoot any, we're going to put some of this rail lube on it. And right here it says that we need to be waxing the rail and the strings every 5 shots. So I don't think I do it every 5 shots, but you know, just a good rule of thumb is to make sure that you have rail lube on the rail itself. That's going to lubricate the string as it's going down the rail here, making sure you're not going to wear your string out too much. So you may be asking yourself, when is it a good time to replace my strings? Well, if you're looking at this, what's wearing out right here is not the string itself. The string's really good, but this right here is the serving or the center serving on this crossbow string. So yeah, we are getting some spots where it's getting a little flat, some spots where, you know, it's wearing down just a little bit more than it probably should, but nothing out of the ordinary. You know, crossbows have a ton of pressure on them, so you're going to get this flattening of the string. You're going to get some of these abrasive spots here. That's nothing to worry about. So what you really want to be worrying about is if your string is stretching too much, or if your string is, you know, losing some of its fibers, the fibers are getting frayed and things like that. That's what you really need to be concerned about. So, you know, you can take your crossbow out, shoot it, make sure it's still in time. You know, if it's not in time, you may be seeing your arrows, you know, drifting, kind of fishtailing and things like that. That may indicate that one of your cams are out of timing and they may need to be adjusted. So, you know, I would take it to a bow shop and get that done. That way they can apply the pressure they need to in a bow press and get this thing safely worked on. You know, it's kind of hard to do it at home without a bow press. But, you know, just a good rule of thumb for the maintenance aspect here, making sure you're going through and ensuring the cables are still in good condition. You know, this right here possibly could be a concern. But once again, it kind of looks like the serving is separating a little bit. But I would have to take this out to the range and, you know, put some bolts down range to make sure this thing is still in time. And if this thing hasn't stretched too much, if this is just from where it's kind of being stretched because of the curvature of the cam here, I think we're going to be okay. It's not necessarily affecting the actual quality of the string itself. So you can tell through here, you're going to have some little spots where you can see where it's raising up. But once again, this thing's been in storage in my bow case, and I haven't applied any of this string wax or anything like that. I've actually cleaned it off before the end of the year. That way it's just nice and dry. And there's still wax on it in the fibers, but I go ahead and clean it really good before I put it away. But it's just enough to keep it lubricated where it's not drying out in the off season. So down here, if you have a spot where your bus cables go through, then you really want to make sure this is lubricated as well, and make sure that there's wax on the string under there in those high friction areas. And my crossbow, you can take this whole front portion off, and then that way you can slide out the cables here and you can wax them really good. So I suggest doing that pretty much at the beginning of the season if you're going to be putting a lot of rounds through this thing. So one thing you want to do when you're going to wax the strings is you want to only wax the part that is exposed. So you don't want to be rubbing it on any of the serving material. So you can tell this is serving material, this is serving material, this is center serving material. It's a little bit thicker than the rest of the serving. And you may be asking yourself why, because it's getting the lube on it from the rail. Yeah, it is. So I would only worry about this part of the string with the bow wax. This part's going to get lubricated by the rail lube. So I like to just put it on there. And you can apply this stuff pretty thick. And then I'm just going to take my fingers and kind of just rub this in, and kind of going with the curvatures and the grain of the string here. I'm just going to kind of press that into the bowstring itself. You can do that for every aspect. I'm not going to capture it here on video, but every aspect of the string that is exposed like that, we can go ahead and use that bow wax on it. Okay, since we're already right here, I'm going to look at the condition of the string dampeners, because it is rubber. They can dry rot over time. Just making sure there's no cuts in the rubber itself. But they look good. They do have the indentation from the string, but nothing to be concerned about there. The system itself still seems rigid. There's no cracks or anything in the mounting portions of it. So all that's good. So moving down into like the frame, making sure there's no cracks or damage to the structure of the frame here. That's some typical things I look for, as well as making sure my limb pocket bolts are tightened down, because once again, there's a lot of vibrations coming off this thing, a lot of speed and force that's created here. So just making sure all of the bolts throughout the whole Crossbow are tightened down really, really good. And there's nothing missing, no hardware missing on this thing whatsoever. You know, looking up here where the cable's attached, making sure all of my C-clips are still intact, nothing's missing, as well as all of these little nuts and bolts are tightened as well. So it's just a good rule of thumb to go through, make sure everything is tightened down. That way you're starting out the season fresh and you're not having to worry about maintenance issues. So with the limbs are typically on a Crossbow where you see failure happen. So I'm looking for any kinds of stress fractures, any kind of cracks, or any type of damage to the limbs. That's what I'm looking for. A lot of times you'll see it in like these thinner areas. You'll see some cracks starting to form or separation of those fibers in those limbs. Sometimes you'll see it up here where it's kind of connected to some of the limb pockets. You can get some stress fractures up in there, but you know, I'm looking throughout the whole limb, making sure there's no damage there. So, you know, if you had damage here, you do not want to use this Crossbow at all, because there's a ton of force on it and you'll end up making this thing explode in your face, and that is not what you want to happen. So definitely make sure you're playing it safe here. If you have damage, do not use it. Go get it repaired. Looking at my cams, making sure the cams are not, you know, lopsided or something like that, where it might indicate that it's out of tune. Making sure everything is still riding good in there, making sure those bushings are intact still, and that the cables are attached where they need to be attached at. Because, hey, you rattling around in a bow case, you never know, something might get thrown off. You just never know if it's been sitting in storage for a long amount of time. So that pretty much covers this part of the bow. Moving on up, you know, we've already said make sure the rail is lubed, but also make sure that the ridge down in here, the little valley, is cleaned out. There's no debris or anything like that in there, because ultimately you want to keep all that debris out of the firing mechanism up here, and just making sure all of this is free of debris, because, you know, this thing does take a beating throughout the season. I know I get all kinds of twigs and stuff caught on this thing in the woods, So just making sure that this whole mechanism right here is just free of debris is kind of one of the main concerns here, because this is where all the safety happens. It's where you want to be as precise as possible in making sure everything is good to go. I'm gonna check this brush right here. You may not have a brush. You may have like a little metal piece that kind of goes down and retains that bolt in place. But if this brush were to be getting wore down too much, I may want to reach out to my manufacturer to make sure that I can get a replacement brush in there or a replacement mechanism for whatever crossbow you have. But you want this retainment device to be nice and intact. That way your bolt's not going to be rattling around in there, and it's going to be nice and secure when it's in this fully seated position. So if this were to be, lodged in there with debris or something, make sure you're taking a Q-tip or something like that and getting all of it out of there and making sure that it's good to go, because you don't want to be about to shoot your trophy buck and then all of a sudden your safety mechanism doesn't work or something like that. Your trigger fails to fire. So you don't want that to happen. So play it safe, making sure there's nothing in there, get it cleaned out. Another thing, you might want to check your trigger, make sure there's no debris up in there. Once again, you're beating and banging this thing through the woods. You put it away in the case, maybe you didn't clean it, but just making sure everything is cleared out of there, make sure it's good to go, as well as tightening down any applicable bolts that you might have back here as well. Any of these little rails, if your bow has the rails, your detachable quiver mount, different things like that, making sure everything's tightened. That way you can start out the season fresh. And probably the last thing that we're going to look at here is making sure that your scope is tightened down. You want to go out to the range, you want to kick off the season right. Make sure your scope is still tightened down. So I'm going to check the bolts up here, making sure these caps are on tight, as well as the ones mounting it to the Picatinny rail, making sure all of those are tight. So another thing after that is making sure your scope is going to be cleaned right out the gate as well. So you have a cleaning cloth, make sure that's cleaned up. Thanks for checking out this video on some just general crossbow maintenance, just things I look at before I go out and start the season. And these are typically things I do before I put my bow away for the off season, okay? Just making sure everything is good to go before I put this thing away. That ensures that when I pull this thing out in the springtime or whenever I want to start practicing again with this thing, that it's going to be cleaned up and good to go, and everything should be in pretty good working order starting out the season. This is just stuff I've been using over the past few years to make sure that my crossbow is in good working order starting that season out. So guys, if you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you. Please head over to my main channel page. Have tons of outdoor related videos, especially videos on crossbow, compound bow, stuff like that. You can find it out there. Guys, thanks for watching. We'll catch you guys later.